Put your fingers into the ash. Not metaphorical ash, real grain ash, fused into black glass at the bottom of a storehouse in Jerusalem. It burned from the inside. A city under siege did this to itself. Rome was outside the walls, and yet the first fatal blow landed in a pantry. So here is the question that will not leave me alone. If Jerusalem had walls, water, and faith, how did it starve to death anyway? I am Professor Adrian Lockwell. In the archives of humanity, I do not begin with speeches or statues. I begin with what you can touch. This storehouse is a witness. Grain means time. Grain means options. Grain means the ability to say no to an enemy because you can wait him out. And this grain was murdered. Listen carefully and you can still hear it. Not trumpets. Not the clean, heroic sound we like to imagine. You hear ceramic jars popping as the heat blooms. You hear children coughing because the alleyways are narrow and the smoke hangs low. You hear men shouting prayers and slogans, not because they are brave, but because fear needs a language. Someone runs past you and their sleeve is singed. The air tastes like bitter wheat and pitch. Now look up from the ash. Jerusalem, spring of the year 70 of the Common Era. Passover season. The city has swelled, pilgrims, families, traders, the devout, the merely curious. More mouths, less food. A ticking clock you can count in loaves. Outside the walls, you have Rome, legions, auxiliaries, engineers, surveyors, men who can turn forests into siege towers and hillsides into ramps. And leading them is Titus, young, sharp, ambitious, the son of the Emperor Vespasian, a man who will one day wear the purple himself. Inside the walls, you do not have Jerusalem as one mind. You have Jerusalem at war with itself. John of Giscala, fierce and clever, a faction leader with a talent for survival. Simon Bar Jora, another leader, another claim to legitimacy, another army in miniature. Eleazar's zealots holding the temple precincts, men who see compromise as betrayal and fear as sin. And between these blades, tens of thousands of civilians who want only two things, bread and a door out. If you've ever wondered how a civilization collapses, do not picture a single dramatic explosion. Picture three councils shouting over one another while the pantry burns. Picture a city with walls so famous they feel eternal, yet the weakest point is not stone. It is trust. The case file begins earlier, in the year 66. Revolt ignites across Judea. Roman garrisons attacked. Taxes, humiliations, the grinding weight of occupation, whatever combination you choose, the match finally catches. Rome responds the way Rome always responds when challenged at the edges, it sends professionals. Vespasian and his son Titus move through the north, through Galilee, taking towns, cutting supply lines, teaching a lesson in methodical violence. And here our most famous witness enters the room carrying ink and gilt. Yosef ben Matishu, Josephus, Jewish commander in Galilee, captured at Jotapata in 67. He will become, under Roman patronage, the chronicler of this catastrophe. He will translate. He will negotiate. He will survive. And because he survives, his voice becomes loud, sometimes too loud. Ask yourself, when history is written by a man whose life depends on the victors, how does truth behave? Does it bend? Does it fracture? Or does it become sharper because the survivor cannot afford to lie in ways that are easily disproven? Keep that question in your pocket. We will need it. In 69, Rome itself catches fire politically, the year of the 4 emperors. Emperors rise and fall in months. Armies decide who rules. The campaign against Judea pauses not out of mercy, but because power must be settled at the center. Vespasian emerges as emperor. And then, in spring 70, Titus comes to Jerusalem with the empire's attention behind him and its logistics beneath him. Jerusalem is not just a city. It is terrain built into theology. Ridges and valleys create natural kill zones. Walls layer upon walls. And above all, the temple complex dominates the high ground like a crown. Whoever controls that precinct controls morale and movement. The temple is not merely a shrine, it is the nerve center, the bank, the symbol, the argument. So here is the strategic reality. Stripped of romance, Rome wants a decisive end to the revolt. The rebels want control of the city and the sacred center, because whoever holds the temple can claim God as a witness. The civilians want to survive. The clock is Passover, swelling the population. And the most valuable object in the city is not a sword. It is a warehouse key. Now, about that grain store we began with. Josephus tells us that inside Jerusalem, factions fought each other, raided each other, assassinated each other, and, most damning, destroyed supplies to weaken rivals. If that is true, it is not simply brutality. It is political logic in its ugliest form. If I cannot rule, I will make governing impossible for you. But Josephus is not a neutral instrument. He writes under Flavian patronage, under Vespasian and Titus, the very family that must justify what it has done. He has motive to paint the rebels as madmen and tyrants, so Rome's destruction looks like surgery, not slaughter. He also has personal motive. Many inside Jerusalem would have called him traitor. If he can frame his enemies as monsters, his own survival becomes less shameful. So what do we do with a witness like this? We do what detectives do. We cross-check. We ask what matches known Roman siege doctrine, what matches human behavior under famine, what matches material traces in the ground. Archaeology does not speak in sentences, but it does speak: destruction layers, ash, arrowheads, ballista stones, collapsed masonry. Rome did not simply knock and enter. This was prolonged. It was intense. Factional violence inside a besieged city is not an invention of Josephus. It is a recurring pathology across centuries. When resources shrink, politics turns into a knife fight over bread. The scale Josephus describes may be sharpened by his agenda, yes. The moral framing may be theatrical, yes. But the basic mechanism, internal rivals turning supplies into leverage, is painfully plausible. And you can test it with simple hunger math. Passover crowds create density. Density accelerates disease and panic. Storehouses become finite points of failure, single rooms where the next month of life is stacked in jars. Whoever controls those rooms controls decisions: who fights, who negotiates, who eats, who is told to be patient for God. Have you ever noticed how quickly ideals change when the stomach is empty? A man who would die for a cause today will steal for a crust tomorrow. Not because he is wicked, but because biology has a vote. Outside the walls, Titus is doing what Roman commanders do best, turning war into procedure. He probes the defenses. He tests gates. He deploys battering rams, siege towers, archers, slingers, artillery. He identifies weak points not with inspiration but with measurement. Roman legions are not just fighters. They are infrastructure with swords. And then comes the engineering move that turns Jerusalem from a battlefield into an hourglass. Circumvallation. A wall built around the city to seal it. No foraging. No smuggling. No negotiated exits. No pressure release. It is bureaucracy in dirt: control the perimeter, control the outcome. Josephus describes this ring wall. Roman doctrine supports it. This is not a one-off fantasy. Rome has done it before. Rome will do it again. The point is not merely to keep defenders in. The point is to keep time on your side. Now, within the city, time behaves differently. Time becomes a rumor. Help is coming. God will intervene. A sign has appeared. In a crisis, the mind reaches for patterns, especially divine patterns, because randomness is unbearable. And if you are already committed to the idea that this city is chosen, then surrender is not strategy. Surrender becomes blasphemy. But be careful. Later traditions often interpret the fall of Jerusalem as divine punishment for internal hatred. That is one perspective, and it is old, an argument made by communities trying to find meaning in trauma. Another perspective refuses to moralize the victims and points instead to imperial domination, Rome's taxation, its brutality, its punitive reprisals, its habit of turning resistance into spectacle. According to this view, catastrophe is baked in, because empires do not like to be told no. Which is correct? The detective in me refuses a sermon as a substitute for analysis. Causes can stack. Rome can be oppressive and internal factions can still accelerate collapse. Colonization can create the conditions, and civil fracture can ignite them. And if you only pick one, you may be choosing the version that flatters your politics rather than the one that fits the evidence. Consider the civilians, because they are the ledger everyone tries to hide. As the siege tightens, people attempt to flee. Some slip through at night, some surrender, some are caught. Josephus tells us deserters are interrogated, and many are crucified as warnings. This, too, fits Roman practice. Crucifixion is not only punishment, it is messaging. The cross is a signpost that says, the empire has time. You do not. Inside, hunger corrodes the social fabric. Hoarding. Informants. Raids for food conducted not by outsiders but by neighbors. Every closed door becomes suspicious. Every shared meal becomes political. And if you want a microcosm of collapse, watch what happens when bread becomes a rumor. People stop asking, is it right? They start asking, is it mine? Josephus includes claims so horrific they make readers recoil, stories of starvation pushed to the edge, including an infamous report of cannibalism. Here we must be precise. Such extremes have occurred in other sieges across history. Famine can break taboos that feel unbreakable. But such stories also function rhetorically. They portray the besieged as cursed, as morally inverted, as a city that has become a warning rather than a community. So I treat the episode as a forensic question. What is plausible under siege conditions? What is amplified for effect? And what does it cost to repeat it uncritically? Because there is always a second casualty in war, the truth that gets used. Used to justify revenge. Used to condemn rivals. Used to make suffering feel deserved so it hurts less to remember. Now let's step into Titus's war room, because the siege of Jerusalem is sometimes described as if it were fate. It was not fate. It was decisions. Logistics. Personal ambition. And a cold understanding that cities do not die when walls fall, cities die when movement stops. Titus has advantages that are easy to underestimate because they are boring on paper. Supply lines. Replacement manpower. Specialized engineers. A culture of discipline that turns fear into routine. A legionary can dig all day and fight all night, because Rome trains the body to obey. Jerusalem has advantages that are easy to romanticize. Walls that have survived assaults before. A population that believes its God is not merely local but sovereign. Sacred geography that turns the city into a symbol, and symbols can inspire people to endure. So why does Rome win? The simple answer is, because Rome can lose men and still win, and Jerusalem cannot lose bread. A city can replace courage, it cannot replace calories on command. Now, we need to name the internal front clearly, because many retellings blur it into the Jews versus Rome, as if Jerusalem were a single fist. Josephus paints three centers of power. John's men. Simon's men. Eleazar's zealots, holding the temple stronghold. Three chains of command. Three strategies. Three versions of legitimacy. Imagine trying to coordinate defense when even the concept of defense is disputed. One faction wants to hold the temple above all, because it is sacred and politically central. Another wants to dominate the city streets, because whoever controls movement controls supplies. Another may believe negotiation is treason, even when starvation is already in the room. And here is a brutal pattern that repeats across eras. When internal enemies matter more than external ones, every resource gets spent twice, once against the invader, once against each other. Every guard post becomes a place to watch your supposed allies. Every ration becomes leverage. Every rumor becomes a weapon. So return with me to the charred storehouse. Why burn it? Who benefits from empty stomachs? The answer is as old as factional politics. Hunger makes people desperate, and desperate people can be steered. If you can feed a man, you can command him. If you can starve him, you can terrify him into obedience. And now, the pivotal minute. We can argue about many moments in this siege, but there is one that changes the physics of the situation. Titus completes the circumvallation, the ring wall. From that hour, movement dies. The city becomes an island of stone in a Roman sea. Notice what changes psychologically. Before the ring wall, there is still a gambler's hope. Someone might slip out to forage, to bring news, to bribe a guard, to negotiate. After the ring wall, hope becomes internal only. Hope becomes prophecy, not strategy. And prophecy, when it fails, does not simply disappoint. It shatters. If you have ever watched a group under pressure fracture into rival truths, each truth demanding loyalty, then you already understand something essential about Jerusalem. In crisis, people do not only ask, "What will save us?" They ask, "Who gets to define salvation?" Titus, meanwhile, does not need to guess. He needs to wait. Waiting is a weapon when you have supplies and your enemy does not. Rome's patience is not gentle. It is a vice. Now let's address a controversy that sits at the heart of how this story is remembered. Did Titus want to spare the temple? Josephus suggests he did, that Titus admired the temple's grandeur, that he sought to preserve it, that its destruction happened amid chaos, perhaps against his wishes. It is an alluring narrative. It gives us tragedy instead of policy. It gives Titus the posture of reluctant destroyer rather than deliberate iconoclast. But opposing arguments press hard against that claim. First, Roman punitive logic. Sacred centers often become targets precisely because they are sacred. Breaking the symbol breaks the will. Second, strategic logic. The temple precinct is high ground and a fortress-like complex. Leaving it intact could leave a future rallying point for rebellion. Third, propaganda after the fact. Rome celebrates the captured treasures in triumph imagery, the spoils become political capital. So which is it? Here is where we must hold uncertainty like a tool, not a failure. Commander intent and battlefield reality can diverge. A commander can give an order and lose control in smoke and screaming. A commander can also later claim reluctance because it sounds better in the record. Josephus could be reporting something he heard, or something he needed to write. Titus could have wanted the temple spared as architecture but not as institution, meaning he wanted it neutralized, not necessarily burned. The evidence tension remains, intent, chaos, and post-war narrative pulling in different directions. But here is what does not change regardless of Titus's private feelings: the temple was destroyed, and the destruction functioned politically. In war, outcomes matter more than claimed intentions. And the assault itself is not a single dramatic rush. It is days and weeks of attrition, probing attacks, sapping, battering, building ramps, dragging timber, moving earth. Men labor until their hands blister, because the Roman way of war is not to be faster, it is to be inevitable. Inside the city, inevitability breeds extremity. When you cannot move outward, you move inward, toward scapegoats, toward purity tests, toward accusations that someone is weakening the cause. Faction leaders tighten control because control feels like oxygen. And civilians become bargaining chips, fed if loyal, punished if suspected. What does Josephus do during all this? He stands between worlds. He calls out to people inside the walls to surrender. He interprets Roman orders. He records. And you can hear, if you listen, the tremor of a man trying to justify himself to the future. Some modern readers despise Josephus for that. They see him as collaborator, a man who chose his skin over his people. Others defend him as a pragmatist, someone who understood that suicide in the name of honor would not save anyone, and that survival could preserve memory. So which is he? Perhaps both. Human beings are rarely pure specimens. In a catastrophe, survival is not a clean moral category, it is a messy, breathing one. And yet, without Josephus, much of the interior drama vanishes into ash. We would have less to argue with. Now, track the cost ledger, because history is often told as if only armies matter. The ledger does not care about our preferences. Massive civilian death, from hunger, disease, and violence. Enslavement and dispersal. Families separated like torn cloth. And the temple, the religious, political, and economic center, erased. This is what combined siege warfare and civil fracture buys you. Not merely defeat. Transformation. A people forced into new forms of religious life without the central altar. A region reorganized under heavier Roman hand. A trauma that will echo for centuries, reshaping identity, memory, and longing. Now I want to return to the tactical pattern, because it is the blueprint beneath the smoke. Rome's strength is not only violence. It is administrative war. Standardized units. Engineers. Supply depots. Roads. Chains of command. A machine that can learn and repeat. Jerusalem's weakness is not only that it is outnumbered. It is that authority is fragmented. Fragmentation is sometimes survivable in peacetime because debate can look like vitality. Under siege, fragmentation becomes hemorrhage. And this is the moment where we must say something uncomfortable. Mythic certainty can be courage, and it can also be refusal to adapt. Believing God will save you can strengthen the spine. It can also close the ears. In Jerusalem, prophecy competed with reconnaissance. Internal legitimacy competed with shared defense. And hunger turned everyone into a suspect. If you feel your chest tighten at that, good. Because this is not merely ancient. This is human. Now, pause with me at a gate, one of those moments that does not make monuments, but decides lives. A mother considers slipping out at night with a child. Not because she loves Rome. Because her child's breath is shallow and her milk is gone. She hears rumors, deserters are crucified. She also hears rumors, some who surrender are fed. Which rumor do you gamble your child on? That is what siege warfare does. It turns ethics into arithmetic under duress. And outside, the Roman ring wall makes sure you cannot escape the math. Now, a question that always returns, could Jerusalem have survived if it had been united? Some argue no, Rome's power was too vast, the legions too professional, the empire too determined to crush a revolt in a province that mattered strategically and symbolically. From this perspective, unity might have changed the timeline, but not the outcome. Others argue unity mattered enormously. A united command could have rationed better, prevented sabotage, enforced discipline, negotiated from a position of coherence, or perhaps even broken out before the ring wall closed. A united city can make an enemy pay such a price that politics back in Rome reconsider. Which argument wins? Here is my forensic answer: unity cannot conjure grain out of air, but disunity can destroy grain you already possess. Unity does not guarantee victory, but fragmentation guarantees waste. And in a siege, waste is death. There is another disputed lens we must examine. Was this primarily a story of religious extremism imploding, or of colonial violence grinding a subject people into revolt and then into ruin? If you choose the first lens alone, you risk turning the victims into the sole authors of their fate and letting empire off the hook. If you choose the second lens alone, you risk ignoring internal agency, the way local power struggles can magnify catastrophe. So I hold both. Rome brought the siege engine, the ring wall, the crucifixions, the punitive doctrine that says resistance must be made unbearable. Jerusalem's factions brought the sabotage, the internal bloodletting, the refusal to share authority even when starvation had already entered the home. And civilians paid for both. Now, we reach the central thesis of this case, the part the ash keeps whispering when the room is quiet. A city does not fall only when an enemy breaks its walls, it falls when its own systems turn survival into a weapon, and the invader simply provides the pressure. Once you see that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. Not in identical costumes, but in identical impulses. The impulse to hoard rather than coordinate. The impulse to destroy resources so rivals cannot use them. The impulse to treat compromise as impurity even when compromise is the only remaining tool. Now, I want to talk about the ring wall again, because it deserves to be remembered as more than a line on a map. Circumvallation is the physical expression of an idea, that people can be governed by controlling movement. When you can decide who enters, who leaves, who trades, who eats, you do not merely win a battle, you design an outcome. And here is the modern echo that makes my pen hesitate, because it is too close. Blockade logic did not die in antiquity. Cut movement, and you control outcomes. Modern sieges, sanctions, and encirclements repeat the same equation with different uniforms. Logistics becomes morality. And the civilian stomach becomes the terrain everyone claims to regret targeting while targeting it anyway. Second echo, information war. Competing authorities inside a crisis zone can turn resources into political weapons. Who controls the warehouses? Who controls the corridors? Who controls the story about why you are hungry? In Jerusalem, factions fought for the right to define reality while Rome measured the circumference. In our era, rival narratives travel faster than bread. But the effect can be the same: paralysis, suspicion, fragmentation. Third echo, infrastructure as sovereignty. Whoever controls water, grain, roads, and keys governs more than whoever controls speeches. The temple was not only a holy site, it was an institution tied to economy and authority. Destroy it, and you reshape society's bloodstream. Now we must confront the witness again, Josephus, because he is also a modern echo. He is our primary narrator, and he is compromised. That is not an excuse to discard him. It is a warning label. Our histories still arrive through interested narrators, states, victors, exiles, defectors, survivors trying to justify the choices that let them live. So the question becomes, how do you read a compromised witness without becoming cynical? You read with two hands. One hand receives the testimony because it is precious: someone was there, someone saw, someone recorded. The other hand tests it: who benefits, what is emphasized, what is omitted, what matches other evidence, what feels like a moral performance. And when you do that with Jerusalem 70, a human pattern appears that is as current as tomorrow's headlines. Under existential threat, communities fracture into purity tests and rival legitimacy claims. The enemy outside becomes useful because internal rivals feel closer, dirtier, more personal. It is easier to hate the neighbor who questions your authority than the distant commander outside the wall. That is why this story matters now. Because the most decisive collapses aren't always breached walls. Sometimes it is a city setting fire to its own grain while the enemy calmly measures the circumference. Sometimes the invader's greatest ally is your internal civil war. So let us return, for the final time, to the artifact witness. The charred storehouse. I picture an investigator, any century, kneeling in that blackened room. He pinches a few grains between thumb and forefinger. They crumble like dry blood. He holds them up to the light. He does not need to be told what they mean. They mean time that was thrown away. Options that were sacrificed. Lives that were priced as political currency. Here is my verdict, the timeless human truth this case leaves on the tongue like smoke. When fear makes rivals feel more dangerous than invaders, people will burn their own future just to keep power in the present. Hold that verdict up as a mirror to today. Look at how often our world rewards the faction that can sabotage best. Look at how often controlling supply, food, fuel, medicine, information becomes a substitute for legitimacy. Look at how often we say we are defending a community while we are actually punishing it into obedience. Jerusalem is not an anecdote. It is a force still acting upon us. If you want to keep thinking like a time detective, join the investigation. Subscribe so you do not miss the next case file, because each episode adds a new tool for reading power, propaganda, and survival in any era. And when this video ends, continue the session with the video waiting on the end screen. It will feel like turning the page to a related document in the same archive. Now leave a comment with your answer to a question you cannot Google, only imagine. You are inside Jerusalem. You know the ring wall is finished. You have access to one storehouse key. Do you use it to feed your faction to hold power, or do you open it to everyone and risk losing control, hoping unity buys one more week of life? When survival is stored in one room, who do you fear enough to burn it?